On December 7th of 1972, the crew of the Apollo 17 captured a photograph that would become a symbol of the Earth as we know it. The blue marble is now an image synonymous with the environmental movement, along with rolling fields of wind turbines and the glowing spiral of complex fluorescent light bulbs. Green symbolism is becoming increasingly apparent in popular media as environmental issues become more urgent. However, the environmental movement did not always have the green figurehead it is associated with today. Environmentalism as we know it stemmed from the conservation movement of the Progressive-era United States. In some contrast to modern green movements, conservationism did not oppose the expansion or consumption of natural resources, but rather focused concerns on the efficiency and sustained renewability of United States land and resources. Between the years of 1869 and 1874, John Wesley Powell, a lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Army, led a series of expeditions to the American West to survey land for the location of forests and water sources, with the intention of usage in new agricultural operations. Powell observed large-scale flooding on the Colorado, San Juans, and Tuolumne rivers from spring snowmelt, followed by very low water levels during the late summer and fall. He concluded that the only way to maintain a year-round water source for a large population or agricultural operation would be through the construction of reservoirs. As westward expansion continued, environmental legislation and control of natural resources began to shift from concerns of local legislation to state and federal government. Theodore Roosevelt was a proponent of conservationism and is credited with being the first president to bring environmental issues to the federal agenda. Implementing the data and recommendations that Powell presented 30 years earlier, the Newlands Reclamation Act was passed by Roosevelt in 1902. The act directed federal budget to the irrigation and maintenance of semi-arid lands in the Southwest, as well as placing 230 million acres of land under federal protection. In 1902, sometime after the Newlands Act had taken effect, Roosevelt requested the creation of the Inland Waterways Commission, a committee intent on observing the progression and usage of new canals, reservoirs, and waterways. Based on the findings of the Inland Waterways Commission, Roosevelt's environmental advisor, Gifford Pinchot, suggested that he appoint federal departments to address ongoing conservation objectives at a national level. In 1902, Roosevelt appointed the Conference of Governors, with the goal of addressing conservationism as a national duty. He also funded the National Conservation Commission, which, in conjunction with the United States Reclamation Service, founded in 1902, became the United States Bureau of Reclamation. Roosevelt's actions to further the conservation movement were not met without opposition, however. Roosevelt and Pinchot's conservationist goal was to make the forest produce the largest amount of whatever crop or service will be most useful, and keep on producing it for generation after generation of men and trees. However, John Muir, a leading preservationist, argued that the only way to preserve natural resources for future generations is to leave them completely untouched. Muir was the founder and president of the Sierra Club, an organization dedicated to the protection, preservation, and enjoyment of the natural environment. Roosevelt and Muir's ideas would both ultimately influence environmental legislation in the Progressive era. Before the end of his presidency in 1909, Roosevelt signed into law the first 5 national parks, signed the Antiquities Act designating national monuments, and established the National Forest Service. The ideas of Theodore Roosevelt, Gifford Pinchot, and John Muir serve as the barometer of environmentalism in the Progressive era, supporting the notion that the U.S. can make total use of its natural resources for an indefinite period of time, as long as resources are controlled in a precise manner and the natural environment is carefully preserved. Modern environmentalism began to take shape throughout the 1960s and 70s through increased public awareness of humanity's impact on the environment. In 1962, Rachel Carson published her groundbreaking novel Silent Spring, which accused the chemical and farming industries of spreading disinformation about the use of pesticides, such as DDT. It was one of the first publicized works to call out an entire industry, arguing that the unregulated use of pesticides was not only detrimental to the health of ecosystems, but to human beings as well. Federal and private investigation confirmed Carson's claims, leading to a decade of environmental housekeeping in the U.S. government. In 1970, the Environmental Quality Improvement Act was passed, with the general objective of instituting specific policy improvements in existing federal departments relating to public works and the environment. In 1972, the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act was passed, forcing greater transparency on chemical distributors as well as increased regulation and enforcement of banned chemicals by the Department of Agriculture. The National Environmental Policy Act was signed into effect by Richard Nixon in 1969. The act set in place a cross-agency procedure regarding environmental policy and set the framework for the creation of the EPA. In 1970, President Nixon issued an executive order to unify all existing environmental responsibility under one federal agency. The Senate passed the request, officially forming the United States Environmental Protection Agency. The EPA has since regulated and enforced environmental bills. The Clean Air Act, originally passed in 1963, was amended in 1970, 1977, and again in 1990 to further regulate emission standards, as well as head research on acid rain and ozone depletion. The Clean Water Act was passed in 1972 as an amendment to the Federal Water Pollution Control Act of 1948. The EPA regulated bill aimed to stop further contamination of rivers and reservoirs, as well as revert already present contamination. EPA-regulated acts continued to be proposed and passed by environmental lobbyists throughout the 1970s, including the Marine Protection Research and Sanctuaries Act of 1972, the Endangered Species Act of 1973, the Safe Drinking Water Act of 1974, the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act of 1976, the Clean Water Act of 1977, and the Superfund Act of 1980. These bills covered the regulation of drinking water sources, the disposal of toxic substances, the protection of marine wildlife, and the protection of wilderness areas. The Green, or Post-Environmentalism movement, places less emphasis on federal lobbying to effect positive environmental impact, as private organizations become increasingly instrumental in developing research and funding environmental protection. UNESCO-founded Earth Day, celebrated April 22nd, continually demonstrates efforts to migrate towards environmental protection efforts and awareness, as seen during the landmark Earth Day 20 and Earth Day 1990. Earth Day 2000 ushered into effect contemporary environmentalism, with the use of internet allowing for connections never previously possible, a new avenue through which to campaign, and the spread of pro-Earth information and imagery. In all, environmentalism has seen a shift from elite federal efforts to maximize land efficiency to an actual understanding of environmental principles by the general population, and preemptive steps to preserve and sustain the world for future generations.